Libidinal materialism, Nietzsche, is not, however, a thermodynamics. This is because it does not distinguish between power and energy, or between negentropy and energy. It no longer conceives the level of entropy as a predicate of any substantial or subsistent being. In contrast to the energy of physical thermodynamics, libidinal energy is chaotic or pre-ontological. Thus Nietzsche's devastating attacks of the notions of being, thing in itself, of a substratum separable from its effects, etc., where thermodynamics begins with an ontology of energy, of particles, Boltzmann, of space-time, and then interprets distributions and entropy levels as attributes of energy, libidinal materialism accepts only chaos and composition. Being as an effect of the composition of chaos, of the approximation of a world of becoming to a world of being. With the libidinal reformulation of being as composition, one acquires degrees of being, one loses that which has being. The effect of being is derivative from process. Because we have to be stable in our beliefs if we are to prosper, we have made the real world a world not of change and becoming, but one of being. The great axes of Nietzsche's thought trace out the space of a libidinal energetics. Firstly, a concerted questioning of the logico-mathematical conception of the same, equal, or identical, die Gleichheit, which is dissolved into a general energetics of compositions, of types, varieties, species, regularities. The power to conserve, transmit, circulate, and enhance compositions, the power that is assimilated in the marking, reserving, and appropriating of compositions, and the power released in the disinhibition, dissipation, and Dionysian unleashing of compositions. Beyond essentializing philosophies lies art, as the irrepressible flux of compositions, the interchange between excitation and communication. Secondly, a figure of eternal recurrence, stretched between a thermodynamic baseline, Boltzmann's theory of eternal recurrence, and a libidinal summit, a theoretical machine for transmuting ontologico-scientific discoveries into excitations. First, the scientific figure. Recurrence is a theory of energetic forces and their permutation, chance, tendency, energy, and information. In the play of anarchic combinations and redistributions, forces tend to the exhaustion of their reserve of possible states, inclining to the circle, a figure of affirmation and intoxication, as well as a teaching, message, or signal. A sea of forces flowing and rushing together, eternally changing, eternally flooding back, with tremendous years of recurrence, with an ebb and a flood of its forms, out of the simplest forms, striving towards the most complex, out of the stillest, most rigid, coldest forms, towards the hottest, most turbulent, most self-contradictory, and then returning home to the simple out of this abundance, without goal, unless the joy of the circle is itself a goal, without will, unless the ring feels good will towards itself. Do you want a name for this world? Then, the libidinal peak, the recurrence of impetus in the ascent through compositional strata, always noch einmal, once again, a never-ceiling horizon, achieved essence. Would you be the ebb of this great flow? Thirdly, a general theory of hierarchies, of order as rank order, composition. There are no longer any transcendental limits. Schopenhauer's grades of objectification are decapitated, and thus depolarized, opened into intensive sequences in both directions. Kant is defeated as transcendental empirical difference is collapsed into the scales, but it takes a long time for such events to reach us. History returns. What could timelessness mean now? To speak of oppositions where there are only gradations and a multiplicitous delicacy of steps. Fourthly, a diagnosis of nihilism, of the hyperbolic of desire. Recurrence is the return of compositional impetus across the scales, the insatiability of creative drive. This is Dionysian pessimism, the recurrence of stimulus, pain, and the exaltation of its overcoming. For the exhausted ones, the schlecht wege kommenen, this is intolerable. For they are stricken with weariness, which would reach the end with one leap, with a death leap, a poor unknowing weariness, which would not will once more. It is that which created all gods and afterworlds. Plato first, then Christianity, feeding on human inertia like a monstrous leech, creating humanity, the terminal animal. Nihilism completes itself in principle at once. God is conceived. A final being, a cessation of becoming, an ultimate thing beyond which nothing can be desired. Freud, too, is an energeticist, although reading Lacan and his semiological ilk one would never suspect it. He does not conceive desire as lack, representation, or intention, but as dissipative energetic flow, inhibited by the damming and channeling apparatus of the secondary process, domain of the reality principle. Pleasure does not correspond to the realization of a goal. It is rather that unpleasure is primary excitation or tension, which is relieved by the equilibrating flux of sexual behavior. There is no goal, only zero. Unpleasure corresponds to an increase in the quantity of excitation and pleasure to a diminution. This compulsion to zero is notoriously ambivalent in Freud's text. The mental apparatus endeavors to keep the quantity of excitation present in it as low as possible, or at least to keep it constant. Far from being a discrediting confusion, however, such ambivalence is the exact symptom of rigorous adherence to the reality of desire, expressing the unilateral impact of zero within the order of identitarian representation. Psychoanalysis, as the science of the unconscious, is born in the determination of that which suffers repression as the consequence of a transgression against the imperative of survival. It is the pursuit of this repressed threat to the ego which carries Freud along the profound arch of thought from sexuality to the death drive. At first, in the period up to the First World War, the attempt to explicitly formulate the site of the most irremediable collision between survival and desire leads Freud to his famous reading of the Oedipus myth and the sense of the father's law, since it is the competition with the father, arising as a correlate of the infant's incestual longing for the mother, that first brings the relation between desire and survival to a crisis. Later, in the formulation of the death drive, the sacrificial character of desire is thought even more immediately, so that desire is not merely integrated structurally with a threat to existence within the Oedipal triangle, but is rather related to death by the intrinsic tendency of its own economy. The intensity of the affect is now thought as inherently oriented to its own extinction, as a differentiation from death or the inorganic that is from its beginning a compulsion to return. But despite recognizing that the conscious self is a modulation of the drives, so that all psychical energy stems from the unconscious, from which ego energy is borrowed, Freud seems to remain committed to the right of the reality principle, and its representative of the ego, and thus to accept a survival or adaptation imperative as the principle of therapeutic practice. It is because of this basic prejudice against the claims of desire that psychoanalysis has always had a tendency to degenerate into a technology of repression that subtilizes, and therefore reinforces, the authority of the ego. In the terms both of the reality principle and the conservative moment of psychoanalysis, desire is a negative pressure working against the conservation of life, a dangerous internal onslaught against the self, tending with inexorable force towards the immolation of the individual and his civilization. Metapsychology is solar psychology. At the heart of Freud's Beyond the Pleasure principle, he sketches out his dazzling cosmic insight. It would be in contradiction to the conservative nature of the drives if the goal of life were a state of things which had never yet been attained. On the contrary, it must be an old state of things, an initial state from which the living entity has at one time or another departed, and to which it is striving to return by the mazings, Umwege, along which its development leads. For a long time, perhaps, living substance was thus being constantly created afresh and easily dying, till decisive external influences altered in such a way as to make ever more complicated mazings, before reaching its aim of death. These mazings to death, faithfully kept to by the conservative drives, would thus present us today with the picture of the phenomena of life. Life is ejected from the energy blank and smeared as a crust upon chaotic zero, a mold upon death. This crust is also a maze, a complex exit back to the energy baseline, and the complexity of the maze is life trying to escape from out of itself, being nothing but escape from itself, from which it tries to escape. Maze wanderer. That is to say, life is itself the maze of its route to death, a tangle of mazings which trace a unilateral deviation from blank. What is the source of the decisive external influences that propel the mazings of life, if not the sun? The most profound word to emerge from the military history of recent times is overkill, a term that registers something from the infernal core of desire. Superficially, it is irrelevant whether one is killed by a slingshot or by a stupendous quantity of high explosive napalm and white phosphorus. And in this sense, overkill is merely an economic term, signifying an unnecessary wastage of weaponry. Yet the Vietnam War, in whose scorched soil this word was germinated, was not merely the culmination of a series of military and industrial tendencies leading to the quantification of destructive power on a monetary basis. It was also a decisive point of intersection between pharmacology and the technology of violence. Whilst a systematic tendency to overkill meant that ordnance was wasted on the already charred and blasted corpses of the Vietnamese, a subterranean displacement of overkill meant that the demoralized soldiers of America's conscript army were wasted, blitzed, bombed out on heroin, marijuana, and LSD. This intersection implies, as can be traced by a systemic linguistic ambivalence, that the absolute lack of restraint, even according to the most cynical criteria, in the burning dismemberment and general obliteration of life, was the obscure heart of an introjected craving, of a desire that found its echo in the hyperbolic dimension of war. Is it not obvious that the hyper-comprehensive annihilation so liberally distributed by the US war machine throughout Southeast Asia became a powerful, if displaced, object of Western envy? Almost everything that has happened in the mass domains of non-institutional pharmacology, sexuality, and electric music in the wake of this conflict attests strongly to such a longing. What is desired is that one be wiped out. After the explicit emergence of an overkill craving, destruction can no longer be referred to any orthodox determination of the death drive as nirvana principle, because death is only the baseline from which an exorbitantly masochistic demand departs. Death is to the thirst for overkill what survival is to a conventional notion of thanatos, minimal satiation. Desiring to die, like desiring to breathe, is a hollow affirmation of the inevitable. It is only with overkill that desire distances itself from fate sufficiently to generate an intensive magnitude of excitation. Thus, in Freud's energetic model of the nervous system, there are two economies that contribute to physical excitation. There is the quantitatively stable energy reservoir deployed by the psyche in the various investments constituting its objects of love, including the ego, and there is the general economy of traumatic fusion with alterity that floods the nervous system with potentially catastrophic quantities of alien excitation. It was Freud's recognition of this second economy and its role in the genesis of the 1914-18 war neuroses, stemming largely from the effects of continuous and overwhelming artillery barrages, that was fundamental to the discovery of the death drive. If such a traumatic economy is readily susceptible to the thought of overkill, it is because trauma is consequential upon an open-ended series of magnitudes within which lethality can be located as an arbitrary degree. It is because the second law of thermodynamics proclaims that entropy always increases in a closed system that life is only able to augment order locally, within an open system from which disorder can be exported. The space in which such localization takes place is not thematized by thermodynamic models, but treated as one of their presuppositions. It is implicitly conceived as homogeneous extension, extrinsic to the distributions which occupy it. Bataille, on the contrary, thinks space rather than assuming it. The base topic associated with such thinking can be summarized under the title Labyrinth, and will be investigated in some detail later in this book. For the moment, however, the issue is a more elementary one, that of theorizing the relation between the closed field of the cosmic energy reservoir, zero, and the local pool of non-equilibrium economy, open to exchange. It is tempting to understand the difference between general and restricted economy as commensurate with that between closed and open systems. In both cases, the former terms seem to refer to the total field of energy exchange, and the latter to the differentiated regions within such a field. A translation of this kind is not wholly inappropriate, but it simplifies the situation excessively. That which circulates in an economy of the kind Bataille describes is less a content with a general and a local intelligibility than the capacity for relative isolation or restriction as such. There is a sense, that of scientific objectivism, in which utility presupposes negative entropy, but abstract order of this kind is quite different from the canalization, which is utility's basic characteristic. The quasi-autonomous territories which inhibit the concrete universalization of the second thermodynamic law are not conditions of composition, as Bataille uses this term. They are composition as such. In other words, composition is simultaneous with the real differentiation of space. It is thus that Bataille extracts production from the idealist schemas which continue to operate within Marx's analysis, those lending the critique of political economy a marked humanist tendency. Work is not an origin, sublating divine creation into historical concretion, but an impersonal potential to exploit, release, energy. The humanized exploitation of class societies is not without a prototype, since surplus production is only possible because of the solar inheritance it pillages. Bataille's solar economics is inscribed within the lacuna in Marxism opened by the absence of a theory of excess, and describes the truly primitive, impersonal accumulation of resources. Such cosmic historical economy is axiomatized by the formula that the energy produced is superior to the energy necessary to its production, and maps out the main sequence of terrestrial development, from which the convulsions of civilization are an aberration. Strictly speaking, the libidinal main sequence, impersonal accumulation, or primary, solar inhibition, emerges simultaneously with life, and persists in a more or less naked state up until the beginning of sedentary agriculture, sometime after the last ice age. Life is simply the name we give to the surface effects of the main sequence. Compared to the violently erratic libidinal processes that follow it, the main sequence seems remarkably stable. Nevertheless, libido departs from its prehistory only because it has already become unstable within it, and even though the preponderant part of the main sequence occurs within a geological timespan, the evidence of a basic tendency to the geometric acceleration of the process is unmistakable. The main sequence is a burning cycle, which can be understood as a physico-chemical volatilization of the planetary crust, a complexification of the energy cycle, or more generally, as a dilation of the solar economic circuits that compose organic matter, knitting it into a fabric that includes an ever-increasing proportion of the inorganic, energetic, and geochemical planetary infrastructure. Of course, the distinction between the organic and the inorganic is without final usefulness, because organic matter is only a name for that fragment of inorganic material that has been woven into metastable regional compositions. If a negative prefix is to be used, it will be more accurate to place it on the side of life, since the difference is unilateral, with inorganic matter proving itself to be non-exclusive or indifferent to its organization, whereas life necessarily operates on the basis of selection and filtering functions. When colloidal matter enters the main sequence, it begins to differentiate two tendencies, which Freud characterized at a higher level with a distinction between phi and psi, or communication and isolation. immanence, transcendence, death, and confusion. Organic libido emerges from the gradual differentiation of what seem superficially to be two groups of drives. Freud does not describe them as such until later. A progressive tendency isolates or individuates the organism, first by nucleation, prokaryotes to eukaryotes, and then through the isolation of a germline, dividing the protoplasm into generative cells and somatic cells. This is the archaic form of Freud's eros. On the one hand, a tension between soma and generation, and on the other, a conservation of dissipative forces within an economy of the species, leading ultimately to sexuality. But this erotic or speciating tendency is perpetually endangered by a regressive tendency that leads to dissolution, thanatos. The phi, or communication tendency, accentuates the various interactions between biological matter and its outside, and is thus equivalent to a lowering of the organic barrier threshold essential to photoreactivity, assimilation, cybernetic regulation, nutrition, etc. This is the complex of organic functions which Bataille associates with primary immanence. The psi, or isolation tendency, is the inhibition of exchange, a raising of the barrier threshold that generates a measure of invariant stability, the conservation of code, controlled expenditure of bioenergetic reserves, etc. The combined operation of these tendencies affects a selective distribution in the degree of fusion between the organism and its environment, a difference that is not given but produced, which precariously stabilizes a level of composition. The maximum state of phi max, is equivalent to the complete dissolution of the organism, at which point its persistence would be a matter of unrestricted chance, free-floating at the edge of zero. At any other level of phi, the organism sustains a measure of integration, and what we call the organism is only this variable cohesiveness or intensity. The real basis of Bataille's transcendence, the maze fringe of death. Isolation or transcendence, psi, is an intensive quantity, since it lacks pre-given extensive coordinates. In other words, there is no logico-mathematical apparatus appropriate to the emergence of psi, since psi is itself the basic measure of identifiability or equivalence. Communication, phi, escapes both identity and equivalence because it is indifferentiation or uninhibited flow. The intensive zero, energy blank, silence, death. Only differentiation from phi, d phi equals psi, is able to function as a resource, storing energy and precipitating compositions, forms, behaviors, signs. The intensive quantity psi is therefore the basis and currency of extensive accumulation. Bataille's economics is based on the principle that extensive exchange, psi 1 to psi 2, is primitively accumulative. The extensive exchange is comprised of two intensive transitions, an expenditure, psi to phi, and an acquisition, phi to psi, with the latter always exceeding the requirement of replacement, so that psi 1 is less than psi 2. Bataille's emphasis on this point leaves little room for misunderstanding. The energy that the plant appropriates to its mode of life is superior to the energy strictly necessary to that mode of life. The appropriated energy produced by its life is superior to the energy strictly necessary to its life. It is of the essence of life to produce more energy than that expended in order to live. In other words, the biochemical processes are able to be envisaged as accumulations and expenditures of energy. All accumulation requires an expense, functional energy, displacement, combat work, but the latter is always inferior to the former. More technically, psi 1 to psi 2 equals d phi to d plus n phi. Marx entitled his basic project The Critique of Political Economy, which is something similar to what some might now call a double reading, in that, interpreting the accounts that the bourgeoisie gave of their economic regime, Marx found that the word labor was being used in two different senses. On one hand, it was being used to designate the value imparted by workers to the commodities they produce, and on the other hand, it was being used to designate a cost of production, or price of labor to an employer. With the ascent of the Ricardian school, the tradition of political economy had reached broad agreement that the price of a commodity on the market depended upon the quantity of labor invested in its production. But if workers are being paid for their labor, which then adds to the value of the product, it is impossible to detect any opening for profit in the production and trading of goods. Marx's basic insight was that being paid for one's labor and the value of labor were not at all the same thing. He coined the term labor power, Arbeitskraft, for the object of transaction between worker and employer, and kept the word labor, Arbeit, solely for the value produced in the commodity. Having thus distinguished the concepts of labor and labor power, the next step was to explore the possibility that labor power might function as a commodity like any other, trading at a price set by the quantity of labor it had taken to produce. The difference between the capacity for work and the quantity of work necessary to reproduce that capacity would unlock the great mystery of the origin of profit. If labor were traded in an undistorted market with complete cynicism, it should command a price exactly equal to the cost of its subsistence and reproduction at the minimal possible level of existence, just as any other commodity traded in such a market should tend towards a price approximating to the cost of the minimal quantity of labor time needed for its manufacture. Marx thus speculated that the average price of labor within the economy as a whole should remain broadly equivalent to the subsistence costs of human life. Thus, value of labor, price of labor, equals profit. But why is it that labor power comes to trade itself at a price barely adequate to its subsistence? There is a twofold answer to this, the first historical and the second systematic, although such separation is possible only as a theoretical abstraction. Both of these interlocking arguments are accounts of the excess of labor or of the saturation of the labor market. 1. In the section of Capital entitled The So-Called Primitive Accumulation, Marx attempts to grasp the inheritance of capital, and is led to examine a series of processes which are associated with the events in English history which are usually designated by the word enclosure. Broadly speaking, the mass urbanization of the European peasantry, which separated larger and larger slices of the population from autonomous economic activity, was achieved by a more or less violent expulsion from the land. Quote, "The prelude of the revolution that laid the foundation of the capitalist mode of production was played in the last third of the 15th and the first decade of the 16th century. A mass of free proletarians was hurled on the labour market by the breaking up of the bands of feudal retainers who, as Sir James Steuart well says, everywhere uselessly filled house and castle. Although the royal power, itself a product of bourgeois development, in its strife after absolute sovereignty, forcibly hastened on the dissolution of these bands of retainers, it was by no means the sole cause of it. In insolent conflict with king and parliament, the great feudal lords created an incomparably larger proletariat by the forcible driving of the peasantry from the land, to which the latter had the same feudal rights as the lord himself, and by the usurpation of the common lands. The rapid rise of the Flemish wool manufacturers, and the corresponding rise in the price of wool in England, gave the direct impulse to these evictions. The old nobility had been devoured by the great feudal wars. The new nobility was the child of its time, for which money was the power of all powers. Transformation of arable land into sheep walks was, therefore, its cry." End quote. Urbanization is thus in one respect a negative phenomenon, a type of internal exile. In the language of liberal ideology, the peasantry is thus freed from its ties to agrarian production. Liberté. 2. The labour market is historically saturated by the expropriation of the peasantry, but it is also able to generate such an excess from out of an intrinsic dynamic. In other words, capital creates unemployment due to a basic tendency to overproduction. The pressure of competition forces capital to constantly decrease its costs by increasing the productivity of labour power. In order to understand this process, it is necessary to understand two crucial distinctions that are fundamental to Marx's theory. Firstly, the distinction between use value and exchange value, which is the distinction between the utility of a product and its price. Every commodity must have both a use value and an exchange value, but there is only a very tenuous and indirect connection between these two aspects. An increase in productivity is a change in the ratio between these facets of the commodity, so that use values become cheaper, and labour power can be transformed into a progressively greater sum of utility. Marx seeks to demonstrate that this transformation is bound up with another, which has greater consequence to the functioning of the economy, and which is formulated by means of a distinction between fixed capital and variable capital. Fixed capital is basically what the business world calls plant. It is the quantity of capital that must be spent on factors other than direct labor in order to employ labor productively. As these factors are consumed in the process of production, their value is transferred to the product and thus recovered upon the sale of the product, but they do not, in an undistorted market, yield any surplus or profit. Variable capital, on the other hand, is the quantity of capital spent on the labor consumed in the production process. It is capital functioning as the immediate utilization of labor power or the extraction of surplus value. It is this part of capital, therefore, that generates profit. Marx calls the ratio of variable capital to fixed capital the organic composition of capital, and argues that the relative increase in use values or improvements in productivity are, given an undistorted labor market, associated with a relative increase in the proportion of fixed capital and thus a decrease in profit. The problems that have bedeviled Marxian theory can be crudely grouped into two types. Firstly, there is the empirical evidence of increasing metropolitan profit and wage rates, often somewhat hastily interpreted as a violation of Marxist theory. In fact, the problem is a different, though associated one, the absence of a free market in labor. Put most simply, there has never been capitalism as an achieved system, but only the tendency for increasing commodification, including variable degrees of labor commodification. There has always been a bureaucratic cooperative element of political intervention in the development of bourgeois economies, restraining the more nihilistic potentials of competition. The individualization of capital blocks that Marx thought would lead to a war of mutual annihilation has been replaced by systematic state-supporting cartelling, completely distorting price structures in all industrial economies. The second problem is also associated with the state-capital complex, and is that of bureaucratic socialism or red totalitarianism. The revolutions carried out in Marx's name have not led to significant changes in the basic patterns of working life, except where a population was suffering from a surplus exploitation compounded out of colonialism and fascism, and this can be transformed into normal exploitation, inefficiently supervised by an authoritarian state apparatus. Marxism, it is widely held, has failed in practice. Both of these types of problem are irrelevant to the Marxism of Bataille, because they stem, respectively, from theoretical and practical economism, from the implicit assumption that socialism should be an enhanced system of production, that capitalism is too cynical, immoral, and wasteful, that revolution is a means to replace one economic order with a more efficient one, and that a socialist regime should administer the public accumulation of productive resources. For Bataille, on the contrary, capital is not a cohesive or formalizable system, but the tyranny of good, the more or less thorough rationalization of consumption in the interests of accumulation. Revolution is not a means, but an absolute end, and society collapses towards post-bourgeois community, not through growth, but in sacrificial festivity. Beyond political economy, there is general economy, and the basic thought at its heart is that of the absolute primacy of wastage, since everything is rich which is to the measure of the universe. Bataille insists that all terrestrial economic systems are particular elements within a general energy system founded upon the unilateral discharge of solar radiation. The sun's energy is squandered for nothing, equals zero, and the circulation of this energy within particular economies can only suspend its final resolution into useless wastage. All energy must ultimately be spent pointlessly and unreservedly, the only questions being where, when, and in whose name this useless discharge will occur. Even more crucially, this discharge or terminal consumption, which Bataille calls expenditure, dépense, is the problem of economics, since on the level of the general energy system, resources are always in excess, and consumption is liable to relapse into a secondary, terrestrial productivity, which Bataille calls rational consumption. The world is thus perpetually choked or poisoned by its own riches, stimulated to develop mechanisms for the elimination of excess. It is not necessity, but its contrary, luxury, which poses the fundamental problems of living matter and mankind. In order to solve the problem of excess, it is necessary that consumption overspills its rational or reproductive form to achieve a condition of pure or unredeemed loss, passing over into sacrificial ecstasy or sovereignty. Bataille interprets all natural and cultural development upon the earth to be side effects of the evolution of death, because it is only in death that life becomes an echo of the sun, realizing its inevitable destiny, which is pure loss. This basic conception founds a materialist theory of culture far freer of idealist residues than the representational accounts of the dominant Marxist and psychoanalytic traditions, since it does not depend upon the mediation of a metaphysically articulated subject for its integration into the economic substrate. Culture is immediately economic, not because it is traversed by ideological currents that a Cartesian pineal gland or a dialectical miracle translates from intelligibility into praxis, but because it is the haunt of literary possibilities that constantly threaten to transform the energy expended in its inscription into an unredeemed negative at the level of production. Poetry, Bataille asserts, is a holocaust of words. A culture can never express or represent, serve, capital production. It can compromise itself in relation to capital only by abasing itself before the philistinism of the bourgeoisie, whose culture has no characteristics beyond those of abject restraint and self-denigration. Capital is precisely and exhaustively the definitive anti-culture. Capitalism, then, is the projection of the most extreme possible refusal of expenditure. Bataille accepts Weber's conclusions concerning the relationship between the evolution of capital accumulation and the development of Protestantism, seeing the Reformation critique of Catholicism as essentially a critique of religion insofar as it functions as a means of economic consumption, or as a drain for the excess of social production. The Protestant repudiation of indulgences, as well as its rejection of lavish cathedral building and the entire socio-economic apparatus allied to the doctrine of salvation through works, is the cultural precondition for the economy closing upon itself and taking its modern form. Bourgeois society is thus the first civilization to totally exclude expenditure in principle, opposed to the conspicuous extravagance of aristocracy and church, and replacing both with the rational or reproductive consumption of commodities. It is this constitutive principle of bourgeois economy that leads inevitably to chronic overproduction crisis and its symptomatic redundancies of labor and capital. It is not that capital production invents the crisis which comes to be named market saturation. It is rather that capital production is the systematic repudiation of overproduction as a problem. To acknowledge the necessity of a stringent, although perpetually displaced, limit to the absorption of surplus production is already to exceed the terms in which the bourgeoisie or administrative class can formulate its economic dilemmas. A capital economy is thus one that is regulated as if the problem of consumption could be derived in principle from that of production, so that it would always be determinable as an insufficiency of demand. During the period roughly between 1930 and 1980, this has typically led to quasi-Keynesian solutions nucleated upon U.S. armament spending. Bataille, in contrast, does not see a problem for production in the perpetual reproduction of excess, but rather in a manner marking the most radical discontinuity in respect to classical political economy, sees production itself as intrinsically problematic, precisely insofar as it succeeds.